In this video, we're going to learn how to use all 23 tools in Inkscape version 1.3. And if you don't see all 23 tools, you can hover over the edge of the toolbox here until you see a double-sided arrow, then click and drag to resize the toolbox. Alright, starting from the top, we have the Selector Tool. As the name implies, the Selector Tool lets us select objects. We can also drag a selection box around one or more objects, or we can select one object, then hold Shift and select or deselect other objects. We can also use the Selector Tool to move objects around, and by using these arrow handles on the corners and sides, we can scale the objects. Holding Ctrl as we do this will lock the width to height ratio, and holding Shift lets us scale from the center of the object. We can also rotate and skew a selected object. To do this, we first click the object again, which changes the appearance of the handles. Now the corner handles let us rotate the object. Holding Alt as we rotate snaps the angle by 15-degree increments, and holding Shift rotates around the opposite corner. With the side handles, we can skew the object. Alt snaps the angle, and Shift stops the opposite side from moving. Rotating and skewing happens around an object's rotation center, which is indicated by this crosshair and is by default located at the center of the object. We can move the rotation center somewhere else, then rotate or skew around that point. In the controls bar for the Selector Tool, we can rotate and flip objects, and we can move them above or below other objects. One more cool thing we can do with the Selector Tool is, while moving an object around, we can press the space bar to place a copy of the object in that position. Next up we have the Node tool. With the Node tool, we can select and move around the nodes of a path. We can also add nodes to a path, either by selecting two or more nodes and clicking the plus button up here, or by double-clicking a line segment. And if we click and drag a line segment, it would change to a curve segment. And now we have these handles we can use to adjust the curvature. We can also delete nodes. We can break the path at the selected nodes, and we can join nodes together. Using these four buttons, we can change the selected node's type. We can also cycle through the node types by holding Ctrl and clicking a node. Clicking this button here gives us these circular handles at the nodes, which we can use to adjust the rounding of the corner at that node. And if we hold Ctrl and click one of the handles, we can cycle through the different corner types. At the moment, if we select multiple nodes, all we can do is move them around. But if we toggle on this button up here, we can now scale and rotate the nodes as well. Finally, if we would like to be able to access the nodes of a shape object, like this rectangle, we first need to turn it into a path, which we can do by clicking this Object to Path button. Now we have full control over the object shape. Below the Node tool, we have the Shape Builder tool. To use the Shape Builder tool, we first need to have some paths selected. Now if we activate the tool, it shows in gray all the intersecting areas between the paths. If we now click on an area, it will turn blue. This means the area will be added to the shape that we're building. If we click and drag over some areas, they will be combined into a single area, and the lines between them will disappear. If we hold down Shift, the tool's color changes to pink. And now if we click on some areas, it will delete them. Finally, to finish creating the shape, we can click the check mark button up here. And now we can change the colors of the individual parts. In the next section of the toolbox, we have the 5 shape tools. With the first one, the rectangle tool, we can create rectangles. After we create one, we get these square handles for adjusting the width and height. If we hold down Control, it will let us scale in only one dimension. We also get these circular handles for rounding the corners. If we want to make the corners sharp again, we can click this button up here. If we start creating another rectangle, we can hold down Control to restrict the width to height ratio. This will allow us to create perfect squares. And if we hold Shift, it will draw out from the center. The second shape tool is the Ellipse and Arc tool. With this one, we can create ellipses. And like with rectangles, we get these square handles for adjusting the size. With these circular handles, we can drag around the outside of the ellipse to create segments or slices. And if we drag inside, we can create arcs. If we take a look up here, we have some buttons for changing the shape. We can choose Slice, Arc, and Chord. The main difference between arc and chord is that with chord, the stroke continues across the flat part, whereas with arc, the points don't connect. And finally, with this button, we can switch back to a full ellipse. Like with the rectangle tool, holding Control lets us restrict the ratio, allowing us to make perfect circles, and holding Shift draws out from the center. Next up is the Star and Polygon tool. This tool by default lets us create 5 cornered stars. And we can come up here and change the number of corners. Using this outer diamond handle, we can adjust the tip radius of the star. This also rotates it, but we can stop the rotation by holding Control. With the inner handle, we can adjust the base radius, as well as skew the star, which we can stop by holding Control. The spoke ratio setting up here refers to the base radius to tip radius ratio. We can right-click the box to get some options for stars that have a particular number of corners. The 2 other settings we have are rounded and randomized. Rounded lets us round the corners. We can also do this easily by holding Shift and dragging one of the handles. And with randomized, we can randomize the angles of the corners, which we can also do by holding Alt and dragging a handle. If we click this button here on the right side of the controls bar, it will reset everything back to the default 5-cornered star. Now if we come over here to the left and click this Polygon button, we get a 5-cornered polygon. We can change the number of corners, and we can use this handle to adjust the radius and rotate it. And like with stars, we can hold Shift to round the corners and Alt to randomize them. And again, we can click the Reset button to switch back to a 5-cornered star. Finally, while creating a star or polygon, we can hold down Control to snap the angle of rotation. The next shape tool is the 3D Box tool. This one lets us create 3D boxes. If we click and drag the X at the center, we can move the box around in 3D space. We can also use these diamond handles at the corners to resize the box in different directions. Holding Control constrains the direction, and holding down Shift allows us to go along an opposing direction. We can also see these different colored pairs of lines extending from the sides. These are the vanishing points, with the X-axis vanishing point located at the center of the page's left side and the Z-axis point located at the center of the right side. The Y-axis vanishing point is by default parallel, so it goes off to infinity. But we can change that by toggling off the parallel button up here for angle Y. If we do make a vanishing point parallel, we can change its angle. We can also move the vanishing points around. You might notice, however, that this also affects the other box. This is because by default, all of the boxes share the same vanishing points. However, if we hold down Shift before moving a vanishing point, it will separate it from the other boxes. Finally, if we want to select a particular side of a box, we can hold Ctrl and Alt and click. The final shape tool is the Spiral tool. The Spiral tool by default lets us create spirals that have a black stroke and no fill. But we can add a fill to it if we want. Using this outside diamond handle, we can roll or unroll the spiral from the outside, changing the number of turns. Holding Ctrl snaps the angle to 15-degree increments. Holding Shift lets us rotate and scale the spiral. And holding Alt will stop the spiral's radius from changing. We can also change the number of turns from the controls bar. With the inner handle, we can change the inner radius of the spiral. And if we hold down Alt, we can change the spiral's divergence to make it either tighter or looser. We can also change the inner radius and divergence from the controls bar. And if we right-click the divergence box, we can see some specific options, like making the spiral a circle, making the edge denser, making the center denser, etc. Finally, with this button on the right, we can reset the spiral settings back to the defaults. We next have some tools for creating paths. First up is the Pen tool. With the Pen tool, we can click points to create connected line segments. And if we click and drag, we can create Bezier curve segments. To finish creating a path, we can either right-click or press Enter. Because we didn't connect the two endpoints, we have an open path. We can continue creating an open path by first clicking one of the endpoints. And to close the path, we can click the other endpoint. The segments in a path are all connected by nodes, which means we can go to the Node tool and modify the path. If we go back to the Pen tool and start creating another path, while creating a curved segment, we can hold Shift, which lets us move the handle under the cursor, and once we release it, it creates a sharp corner. In the controls bar, we have some different modes to choose from, like the Spiral mode for creating super smooth curves. If we hold Shift before clicking, we can create corners. With the B-spline mode, it will automatically create curves for us. Holding down Alt lets us change the position of the previous node. And Shift clicking lets us create sharp corners. The next mode makes it so that we can only create straight line segments. And the final mode is for creating perpendicular lines. The shape setting options here all change the shape of the paths that we draw. For example, triangle in and triangle out both create triangular paths. We can change the width of the path either by using the scale setting up here or by grabbing the Node tool and adjusting this pink diamond handle. With the Ellipse setting, we can draw tapered paths. With the two clipboard options, we first need to have an object copied into our clipboard. Now both From Clipboard and Bin from Clipboard will use the copied object to shape the paths. A key difference, though, is that Bin from Clipboard will also let us shape the path using a group of objects. Under the Pen tool is the Pencil tool. With the Pencil tool, we can draw freehand paths. This by default will give us paths that have jagged edges, but we can use the smoothing setting to create smoother paths. This also results in paths that have fewer nodes. Like with the pen tool, we have some different modes to choose from, including the spiral mode and the B-spline mode. We also have this button for using the pressure sensitivity of a drawing tablet, like a Wacom. If we click it, we get some new settings here. If we have a drawing tablet, we can use pressure to dynamically change the width of the paths to some value between min and max. If we're using a mouse, it will just use the max value. We also have a cap setting for changing the appearance of the endpoints of the path. Finally, if we turn this back off, we can see that we have the same shape setting options as for the pen tool. The final path drawing tool is the Calligraphy Tool. This tool works like a calligraphy brush. We can change the width of the brush up here. We can also adjust the width using the left and right arrow keys, allowing us to change the width as we draw. And if we have a drawing tablet, with this button turned on, we can use the tablet's pressure to adjust the width dynamically. If we turn on this next button, the width of the brush will be determined by the background color. White gives us the minimum width, and black gives us the max width. For thinning here, if we use a positive value, drawing faster makes the stroke thinner. A negative value has the opposite effect. A large mass value causes the brush stroke to lag behind the cursor, which lets us get a smoother result. The angle setting refers to which angle will give us the thinnest stroke. So with a value of 30, drawing at a 30-degree angle gives us the thinnest stroke. And if we have a drawing tablet, we can toggle on this button to use the tilt of the pen to alter the angle. The fixation setting controls how much thinner the stroke will become if we draw at the angle given in the angle setting. If we set fixation to 0, the width will stay the same regardless of the drawing angle. With caps, we can change the appearance of the ends of the brush stroke. This actually works better with a low fixation. Trimmer lets us roughen up the edges of the stroke. And finally, Wiggle makes the stroke wavy. We also have various brush presets we can choose from, which use different settings. And we can even save our own presets. One more thing we can do with the Calligraphy tool is create hatchings. To do this, we draw a stroke, then if we hold down Ctrl, the next strokes we make will follow along the curvature of the previous stroke, and the gaps between them will be equal. Next up, we have the Text tool. To use this tool, we simply click in the canvas and start typing, and it will create a text object using our text. The default size is pretty small though, so we can come up here to the controls bar and change the font size. Another way to resize the text is to go to the Selector Tool and use the scale handles. But we'll need to hold down Ctrl to maintain the aspect ratio. Back in the controls bar for the text tool, we can change the text object's font family, as well as its font style. And actually, if we select a part of the text, we can change the attributes of just that part. If we have multiple lines in the text, we can come up here and adjust the baselines. We can also adjust the alignment of the text. And if we select one or more characters, we can make them a superscript or a subscript. If we click the spacing box here, we can adjust things like the spacing between letters and the spacing between words. We can also adjust the horizontal and vertical kerning, which only affects the spacing between the letters to the left and right of the cursor. We can also kern by holding down Alt and using the arrow keys. And with this setting, we can rotate the character that's to the right of the cursor. With these three boxes here, we can change the direction in which the text is written. Finally, back over here at the start of the controls bar, we have a Font Collections button. If we click the Open Collections Editor button here, we can click this plus button to create a new font collection. Then we can drag fonts into it. Now we can close this out, and if we check the box next to our new font collection here, the font family box will now only show the fonts we added to the collection, plus some fonts we used previously. To go back to showing all of the available fonts, we can click this Reset button. Another thing we can do with the Text tool is create flowed text. To do this, we click and drag, which creates a box. And now as we type, the text will stay inside the box. And we can resize the box using this diamond handle. The next tool we have is the Gradient tool. With the Gradient tool, if we double-click an object, the object by default gets a linear gradient fill going from fully opaque on the left to fully transparent on the right. We can see the gradient line going across the center of the object, and we get a handle at each end. These are called stops, and we can move them around to change the positioning and direction of the gradient. Holding Ctrl snaps the rotation angle to 15-degree increments. Holding Ctrl and Alt lets us change the length without affecting the angle. And Ctrl and Shift changes the length in both directions. We can also change the colors of the stops. And if we double-click the gradient line, we can add more stops, which we can move around and change the colors of. We can remove a stop by pressing Delete. In the controls bar, we can reverse the direction of the gradient, and we can change how the gradient is repeated along the object. Over here on the left, we have the option of switching to a radial gradient. In order for this to take effect, we have to either double-click the object again or just click and drag over it. Radial gradients start from a center point and move out, with two gradient lines that share the same stops. We can move the entire gradient using the center handle. And if we hold Shift as we do this, it lets us move the focal point of the gradient. And finally, we have the option of adding a gradient to an object's stroke. The next tool is the Mesh tool, which lets us create mesh gradients. To use it, we first choose whether we want to use a normal mesh or a conical mesh, whether we want to apply it to an object's fill or its stroke, and how many rows and columns we want to start with. Then, like with the Gradient tool, we double-click an object to apply a mesh gradient to it. By default, the colors in a mesh gradient alternate between white and the original fill color. We can move around the nodes of the mesh, and we can change their colors. We can also adjust the curvature of the mesh using these circular handles. If we double-click a horizontal line, we can add columns. And if we double-click a vertical line, we can add rows. If we select some nodes that have a curved line between them, we can straighten the line with this button up here. If we click the button again, it gives us back the handles for adjusting the curvature. If we have an image in our document, we can draw an object on top of it, go to the Mesh tool, add some extra rows and columns, apply the mesh to the object, and now if we select all the mesh nodes, we can use this button up here to sample the colors from the image underneath the object. If we choose the conical option up here, we can apply a conical mesh to an object, which starts from the center and spreads out. Next we have the Dropper tool. With the Dropper tool, if we click on any color in the canvas, it will change the selected object's fill color to that color. If we hold Shift and click a color, it will set the object's stroke color to that color. We can also click and drag over some colors to choose the average of the colors under the cursor. And we can do the same for the stroke by holding Shift. If we hold down Alt and click a color, it will use the inverse of the color. Similarly, holding Shift and Alt will choose the inverse for the stroke. In the controls bar, we have two toggle buttons labeled Pick and Assign. When both are turned on, the opacity of the chosen color will also be applied to the selected object, as shown in its alpha channel. With Assign turned off, the opacity will be ignored. With Pick turned off, it will use the exact color under the cursor, while keeping the selected object fully opaque. Beneath the Dropper tool is the Paint Bucket tool. With the Paint Bucket tool, we can click on an object and it will fill in the object's area with a new path. And what the tool actually does is, it stores the color information of the pixel that we first click, then fills in the surrounding pixels until it reaches pixels that don't match the first pixel, like where two different colored objects overlap. If we have two overlapping objects with colors that are similar, we can increase the threshold setting up here. Then we can fill in the areas of both objects with a single path. We can also use the Paint Bucket tool to fill in empty areas between overlapping objects. But because the tool works in pixels, if we zoom in, we can see that it didn't quite reach the edges of the area. However, since we're now zoomed in, we're actually giving the tool more pixels to work with, so if we undo the fill and fill again, it does a better job. We can also use the Grow Shrink By setting up here to either increase the size of the path by using a positive value, or decrease the size by using a negative value. If an area that we're trying to fill isn't completely enclosed due to a small gap, the tool won't fill it in. But we can use the Close Gap setting to try to ignore the gap. After we create a new path in an area, it selects the path, so we can easily change its color. This also changes the color of the tool, so if we fill in another area, it will use the new color. Also, if we have a path selected and we hold down Shift before filling in an area, it will combine the new path with the previous selected path. The Fill By setting in the controls bar lets us choose to only consider a particular attribute of the pixels when filling them in. For example, if we choose Alpha, the tool will fill in all overlapping areas that have the same transparency, regardless of how similar or different the actual colors are. As I've demonstrated in a previous video, the Paint Bucket tool is great for adding color to line artwork. Next up, we have the Tweak tool. The Tweak tool lets us transform and sculpt selected objects in various ways, depending on which mode we have chosen. With the default mode of Move, we can click and drag through the objects to move them in the same direction. The Width setting lets us control how large of an area to affect. And the Force setting refers to how strong of an effect the tool will have on the objects. With the second mode, we can pull objects in toward the cursor. If we hold Shift, we can push them away. The third mode scatters the objects in random directions. With the fourth mode, we can either scale the objects up or hold Shift to scale them down. With the fifth mode, we can either rotate the objects clockwise or we can hold Shift to rotate them counterclockwise. The sixth mode lets us duplicate the objects. But if we use the sixth mode while holding Shift, it will delete the objects instead. The next four modes are for sculpting and will change the actual shape of the objects. With the first sculpt mode, we can drag around the parts of objects in any direction. The second sculpt mode lets us either inset parts of the objects or outset them by holding Shift. With the third sculpt mode, we can either pull parts of the objects toward the cursor or hold Shift to push them away. The final sculpt mode lets us roughen up the edges of the objects. And by the way, the fidelity setting here applies to all of the sculpt modes. The higher the value, the more nodes the tool will likely generate when sculpting. This is especially true of the roughen mode. Finally, we have three color modes. With this first one, we can use the tool's color to paint the objects. We can also choose which color channels of the objects to affect. With the next mode, we can randomize the colors. With the third color mode, we can either increase the blur of the objects or hold Shift to decrease it. The next tool we have in our arsenal is the Spray tool. The Spray tool by default lets us quickly create duplicates of whatever objects we have selected. If we switch to the second mode up here, it will create clones of the original objects. So now if we change the colors of the originals, it will change the colors of the clones as well. The third mode will turn all the copies into one big path. And the final mode lets us remove copies. We can use the width setting to control the size of the spray area. The amount setting affects the quantity of copies. And if we have a drawing tablet, we can use the pressure of the device to control each of these settings. With rotation and scale, both of which go from 0 to 100%, we can add a random rotation and/or scale to each copy. The scatter and focus settings work together. With a low scatter and a low focus, the copies will stay near the center of the spray area. With a low scatter and a high focus, they will stay near the outside. The Open Eye button here lets us draw over non-transparent areas, and the closed one lets us draw over transparent areas. So with both turned on, we can draw over transparent areas like the canvas, and non-transparent areas like this rectangle. If we turn off the Closed Eye button, we can only draw over non-transparent areas. And if we turn them both off, we can't draw anywhere. If we toggle on this button, it will prevent copies of the same color from overlapping. If we turn on the next button, we can force it to maintain a particular offset between the copies. Toggling on the last button here gives us 4 extra toggle buttons. It also opens up the Create Tiled Clones dialog, but the stuff in here can get pretty intense, so we'll save it for a separate video. If we turn on this first new button, and we also have the last button here turned on, it will set each copy's fill color to the color that's at the center of the tool. If we turn off the last button, the color it picks will be the average of all the colors inside the tool. With this button here, we can do the same for the stroke color. And finally, by turning on this button, we can use the inverse of the chosen color. Next, we have the Eraser tool. With the Eraser tool, we have 3 different modes to choose from. The default mode simply lets us delete objects that we pass over as we click and drag. With the second mode, any parts of objects that the red line touches will get cut out of the objects. We also get various settings for this mode. For example, we can adjust the width of the red line. If the value of thinning is positive, the faster we go, the thinner the red line will become. And a negative number has the opposite effect. Caps lets us round the ends of the red line. Trimmer lets us roughen up the edges of the line. With the mask, the higher the value, the more the line will lag behind the cursor, allowing us to get a smoother result. At the moment, even though I have completely cut through some of these objects, if I move them around, we can see that they're all still single objects. However, if I go back to the Eraser tool and toggle on this button, it will break apart any objects that I cut through. With the third mode, instead of actually cutting the objects, it clips them. This means we can get the original object back by right-clicking it and choosing Release Clip. It also means that we can use this mode to cut through objects that aren't paths or shapes, like images. One more thing to know about the Eraser tool is that if we have nothing selected, it will work on all the objects on the canvas. However, if we select some objects, the tool will only work on those objects. The next tool we have is the Connector tool, which is useful for creating diagrams. To use it, if we hover over an object, we get a square handle at its center. And if we click and drag from the handle of one object to the handle of another, it will create a connector line between them. If we go to the Selector tool and move one of the objects around, any connector lines attached to it will automatically stretch and rotate in order to stay connected to the other objects. Also, the connector lines behave like paths, so we can change things like their stroke color and stroke width. We can also add markers to them. At the moment, this connector line is passing straight through this object here. But if I select the object and click this button in the controls bar, the line will bend around the object. And I can use the spacing setting to control how much spacing to use between the connector lines and any objects that they're avoiding. Also, if I select the connector line, I can change its curvature. And if I want to make the line pass through the object again, I can select the object and click this button. If I select one or more connector lines, I can toggle on this button to make them orthogonal. Toggling off the button turns them back into straight lines. If I select this entire connector network, I can click this button to try to nicely arrange it. However, I might have to undo that and increase the length setting here first to maintain some distance between the objects. Also, if I decrease the length setting again and toggle on this button, when I click the Arrange button, the objects won't overlap. Next up is the Measure tool. With the Measure tool, we can hover over an object to get some measurement information about it, like its size and position. And if we click and drag over some objects, we get a measure line showing us things like the distances between different points on the objects. We can use the handles at the ends of the measure line to resize it and rotate it. If we hold down Control, we can snap its angle to 15-degree increments. And we can click and drag again to replace the measure line. In the controls bar, we can change things like the font size of the measurements, we can change the number of decimal points, and we can change the scale percentage, which could be useful if we're working on the blueprint of a building, for example. If we toggle on this button here, only the objects that we actually have selected will be included in the measurements. The next button, which is on by default, ignores the measurements between the measure line's endpoints and the first and last points in the objects being measured. If we turn off the next button, it will only show the length and angle of the measure line, as well as the distance between the first and last points, ignoring all of the measurements between the objects. With the next button turned on, we can see measurements between points that are hidden beneath objects, like here and here. And for this button, if we have multiple layers, we can choose to only measure objects in the current layer. If we click this button here, it will reverse the measurements. Clicking the next button will take a snapshot of the measure line. Now we can create another measure line and compare the two. With this button, we can create guides using the measure line, in case we want to draw more objects using these dimensions. This button will convert the measure line into a group of objects. So now we can enter into the group and manipulate it however we want. Finally, if we click this button, it will create a separate line to mark the measure line. And the marked line is a separate object, so it will stay in place if we change the measure line. Also, we can use the offset setting here to control how much spacing to put between the marked line and the measure line. The next tool is the Zoom tool. With the Zoom tool, we can click to zoom in to the point under the cursor. And we can hold Shift and click to zoom out. We also get these buttons in the controls bar, which we can use to zoom in or out, zoom 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 1, zoom in on just the current selection, zoom in on the entire drawing, zoom in on the page width, and if we want to center the page in the document, we can click this button. We can also go back and forth between previous zooms. Probably the most useful feature of the Zoom tool, though, is the ability to zoom in on a particular area by clicking and dragging over the area. The final tool is the Page tool. We can use the Page tool to create multiple pages, either by choosing a format up here and clicking the Add button, or by clicking and dragging in the canvas. We can also select pages, resize them, and move them around. By default, the objects on a page will move with the page, but we can toggle off this button to keep the objects in place. We can reorder the pages either by using these buttons or do the right-click menu. We can also delete pages from here. One more thing we can do is add both margins and bleed to a page. And if we turn on snapping, we're able to snap to both the bleed borders and the margin borders. A cool thing about having multiple pages is that it allows us to export multi-page PDF documents. Alright, so those were all 23 tools in Inkscape 1.3. I hope this video helped you learn some new things about some of the tools you've already been using, and that maybe it has inspired you to use any tools that you've been reluctant to try. Thanks for watching.